Welcome to your first video for Algebra 1. Before we get started, I just want to remind you that you should be taking notes as you're watching this video, and those notes are what is going to count as your homework grade. So make sure you write things down as we go. So domain and range. What is domain? So here's the definition. Go ahead and pause the video at any point in time if you need more time to write things down. I'm just going to continue talking, but don't forget that you can always pause if you need to. So domain is the input values of a relation. If you remember from last year, if you go to plot a point, there's an x value and a y value. The domain are all of the x values. And the values that are in the range are all of the output values, or the y values. So before we get a little bit more into domain and range, we're going to talk about functions. A relation is a function if each input has exactly one output. So we're going to be using these vocabulary words, relation, functions, and we'll certainly be getting a little bit more in depth with those vocabulary words in class. But go ahead and take that down, and I'm definitely going to be going a little bit more into that in class. So if we're using a graph to determine whether or not a relation is a function, we use what we call the vertical line test. And this is how it works. So we have a graph, and what we're going to do is take a vertical line. Unfortunately, you won't have the groovy tools that I do. Yes, I just used the word groovy. And we're going to slide that line from left to right. And we're going to see if that line hits the graph in any spot more than once. In our first graph, we see that it does not hit it more than once. So this relation is in fact a function. So I'm just going to add that on the bottom here. Yes, function. However, in our second graph, we have a circle. And so if we took this vertical line and we slid it from left to right, we can see that there are many times that this line hits the graph more than once. So let me just stop it right here, for example. And I can see that the line hits the graph right here and here, which means that this is not a function. So at any point, if that vertical line hits the graph more than once, it's not a function. Not a function. And when you're writing this down in your notebooks, you don't have to get your graphs perfect. Just draw a sketch of what you see. So we're going to go through a few examples, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come up with a vertical line here. What you might do is use your pen or pencil. So when you have something on paper and you're trying to figure out whether or not it's a function, you can take your pen or pencil and kind of form a vertical line and just slide it across the graph to see if it hits more than once. And so for our first relation here, we're going to go ahead and slide over this vertical line, and we can see that it does not hit the graph more than once. So yes, this is a function. Now, for domain and range, we're going to get into very specific notation for domain and range, but for now, I just want you to kind of get the hang of what domain and range are. So domain is all of the x values that are a part of this graph. As you can see right here, we have an open circle. Excuse me. That means that that value is actually not part of the graph, and that value falls at -4. And so also on the other side here, we see an arrow. So that means if I were to come up with an ordered pair all along this line, all of the x values of those ordered pairs would be included in the domain. So this is how we're going to write what the domain is. The domain is actually going to be all of the values of x that are greater than -4, because remember, domain is the x values. Now range includes all of the y values. So the very lowest range value would be 1. And then again, we have this arrow. So that means that this graph is extended past the arrow and just continues to go upward. And so our lowest value for the y values is 1, which means, and we can see that it also includes that value. And so here's the notation we're going to use for that. Y is greater than or equal to 1. Now we are certainly going to go a lot more into domain and range in class. This is just sort of an introduction. So for a second graph here, we're going to take our vertical line and see if it is in fact a function. And we see that it does not hit it more than once. So yes, it is a function. For the domain, I have arrows on both ends and I have one continuous line here. So that means that the domain is all real numbers. We're going to talk a lot about how the number line for the x-axis represents all real numbers, as does the y-axis. This is our x-axis and our y-axis. Like I said, we're going to be getting into that a lot more in class. For the range, our lowest value is -5, and then it goes up from there. So this is how we're going to represent the range. Y is greater than or equal to -5. I'm going to skip over the third one and go to the next page real quick because I just want to show you an example of one that is not a function. And so this one right here, if I take the vertical line and slide it through the graph, I can see that it hits in more than one spot, several times. So that means that that is not a function. Not a function, and if we go to see what the domain is, we can see the lowest value on the x-axis is 0, which means the domain is going to be all of the x values that are greater than or equal to 0. And this is how we represent that. For the y values, we can see arrows at the ends of both sides of this graph, which means this graph is going to continue out this way and also out this way. This particular graph is called a parabola, and we're going to get into that a lot more in class. But for now, when we're talking about the range, we're going to say that this is actually going to cover all of the y-axis eventually, which means that the range is all real numbers. And this is the notation for all real numbers again. So I'm going to have you try on your own numbers 5 and 6, and I'll be looking at that when I collect your homework. Good luck.